Okay, so today I've been getting a lot of questions still about the choosing recommenders, and I realized it would actually be important to devote some time to talking about this in a little more detail, especially since it's professional courtesy to ask people to serve as a recommender at least 3 weeks in advance of a deadline. And since we're now, oh my gosh, we're now October 1st and the deadline's October 26th, this would definitely be something you'd want to get on in like the next, like 5 days, generally. Also, because the more time you give your recommenders, the greater they will appreciate you, one. But then also, the more time they will have to produce a very strong letter of recommendation for you if they haven't already written for you in some capacity. Oh, and I just thought of something else I wanted to mention that's not included in my deck, but I want to emphasize this because this is always a frequently asked question. I always get questions about, I've already had a professor write for me for like 3 other kind of opportunities, and I'm really nervous about asking this person again because I've already bothered them enough. Like, I don't want to ask them. That is the wrong way to think about it. It is your professor's jobs. I mean, it's part of their jobs to write letters of recommendations for you. So you should never be concerned about asking a professor to write a letter of recommendation for you, number one. Two is that if someone's already written a letter of recommendation for you, it is so much easier to like rework that letter for another kind of opportunity than for someone to write it from scratch. Not to say you shouldn't ask people who haven't never written for you to write for you, because it's good to, have different people who have spoken for you, but you should never be concerned about overwhelming someone who's already written for you for other opportunities. Ultimately, like, the number one priority here is people who know you well, which I think gets into my like the slides here. So why are recommenders important? I mean, some of these might seem obvious, but I think it's worth going over a little bit more. So the recommenders in some ways are one of the most important pieces of your application, because you can like wax poetic about yourself for days and be like, I'm the most amazing person. But like, no one's going to take that seriously unless someone else corroborates that narrative and says like, yes, indeed, this person has achieved all these things. They are going to be a change maker. I have like total confidence in their ability to kind of set out to achieve these goals they've outlined, because I've seen them as a candidate in action. And I've seen the ways they've already kind of, embraced this leadership style or, rallied others around a cause. So recommenders, some people might say it's the most important aspect of your application, if anything, because if you have 3 people who are all kind of in like different areas writing in really enthusiastic detail about you, talking about how great you are, the committee is going to think like, wow, I should meet this person. Like, this person seems really great. So it is important to choose your recommenders wisely for this reason, because you do want people who have had that really great insight into you as a person, as a candidate in action, as someone who's able to achieve in the kind of direction and trajectory that you've outlined. Also, you want to think about the ways in which the people you are choosing are able to speak about the criteria of the scholarship. Okay, so who you might choose to write for you for Truman might be different than who you would choose to write for you for, like the athletic award of the year. I mean, like, you could have a coach write for you for Truman, but like there's going to be like different criteria at play here. And you want people for Truman, obviously, who can speak about you in terms that the Truman Scholarship is going to appreciate, which is in terms of being like a leader, someone who's engaged, someone who cares about others, who's committed to like the common good, like these kinds of things. And someone who's committed to developing expertise that is going to be translatable to the public service area that they want to go into, okay? So once again, I want to emphasize, this is a strategic decision. This is not just a transactional type of thing. And the advice I'm giving you is also applicable to any other kind of opportunity. You want to be thinking in these terms about who best to write for you. Okay, so who should you ask? The questions to ask yourself are, number one, like, do they know you well? That seems like probably a pretty obvious question, but one that's worth emphasizing. Do they know you well? Do you feel like you have a good relationship to this person? If you have been in a large lecture course with someone and there was like 100 other students and the only interactions with that person were in that lecture course, that probably is not going to be someone who has a lot of details to add about you beyond like, oh yeah, I remember this person got an A on an exam, which is only so helpful. If, however, you were in a large lecture course, but you went to office hours regularly, met with that professor kind of like outside the class time and developed a relationship with that person, then person might be someone who you would ask. But someone whom perhaps who you had for like a smaller like seminar class, I'm talking in terms of like the academic one now actually, but someone who you had for or perhaps like a smaller seminar class where there's a lot of like discussion based kind of content, perhaps that person got to know you a little bit better and has greater insight into how you're thinking and how you're contributing to kind of the academic community. Can they provide enthusiastic detail and relevant insight about you? I kind of spoke about this. Because ultimately, if a person is just kind of saying, yes, this person showed up to class, they were always on time, they completed all assignments, and they got an A. I mean, you could just think about this from if you were a reviewer, you'd like see that and you'd be like, oh, great, like that's wonderful. But like, I haven't gotten to know anything about this person from reading this recommendation. So that kind of like personal relationship is really important. Also because it will probably make you more comfortable in having a conversation with that person about why you're applying, why you perhaps ask them to write a recommendation for you, given their insight into your credentials and accomplishments in some capacity. Do my recommendations collectively highlight me in the round? What we mean by when we speak about the round. So this is kind of like comes from the idea that you're on a stage and like kind of like lit by different lights on the stage. So you don't want 3 people who are all, say, like 3 professors in the government department who have all kind of taught you for similar classes, all writing for you, because at some point that becomes redundant. I'm learning about one dimension of your kind of accomplishments and achievements, but that's only one dimension. I like to see like a multidimensional person. And so if you were interested in exploring issues pertaining to civil rights and perhaps you had a course on that, like that's great. I definitely need that content about how you have been developing expertise, academic expertise around the issue area. But I'd also want to know, okay, well, what have you done outside the classroom related to like civil rights and who's speaking to you, speaking about kind of your interests in other spaces? It just makes you a more interesting candidate. So that's a consideration here as well. I mean, ultimately though, I would say like the most important thing is like the enthusiastic detail thing. Like you definitely want people who are able to speak about you in enthusiastic detail. Considerations. Sometimes we have people, and so you're juniors, so you might have like a high school teacher that you had a really close relationship with that was just like the bee's knees and like you got along like marvelously, and like when you're back home, like you go and like see this person because it's such an impact on your life. That's great. That's wonderful to have that person as a mentor, but is that person a good person to choose as a recommender for an opportunity like this? Probably not, unless you had still been actively doing things with that person. So like if, let's say you were like actively involved in debate in high school and you're like, oh my gosh, my debate coach has like changed my life. We have such a great relationship. I feel so tight with this person. I would probably say like, no, that's not a good recommender to choose for this, unless you had gone back to your high school and then developed debate camps like for other students and we're like still like doing things. We're still a candidate in action where that person could still speak to kind of your development and evolution. Then that seems like an appropriate recommendation. So emphasis more on recent type of experiences. I would say like anything from like probably like, actually, I would normally say within the last 2 years. So that would still go back to like for your first year, potentially like in the spring, that might still work if you had like a professor that you were really close to. The other thing to think about is authority and position. I'm going to put less emphasis on this because I don't think it's a huge consideration at this point. But if you're debating between, and I feel like actually this point is like relative more important for other kinds of fellowships, but if you were debating between 2 people, like you worked at an organization, some sort of like nonprofit organization, you were like equally close with like, I don't know, and the person who's like a little less senior, and then you also had a really close connection with the person who's like much more senior in that organization. If that's a consideration, I would always go with the person who's much more senior, but only if like you think like they are able to write in the same kind of detail about you. I think I mentioned this in the info session, but there are always people who work on the Hill and want to get like their senator, like worked in the senator's office and want to get the senator to write for them. Almost always those aren't strong letters because it's almost like a template. I can tell you right now, oftentimes it's like a template, like this person answered the phone calls, like answered calls in my office and like did the mail. Like that doesn't give me anything. But if it was from someone who wasn't the senator, who was like kind of like the person who was overseeing the interns, then that person might have a lot more detail to offer, and that would be the more appropriate person. Note, peers, your fellow classmates are never appropriate recommenders. Just never get someone who's like your peer to write for you. That will not be taken seriously. This is a special concern, I know, because many people's leadership experiences come from student-led organizations. So the people who've observed them in that leadership capacity are almost always classmates in those kinds of situations. Doesn't matter. You don't want a classmate, a peer writing for you. And I'll get into this a little bit more later. Family, friends, no. Not your neighbor who's known you since you were 5. That's not, like, this isn't a character reference. This is like speaking to your accomplishments and credentials. And you want people who are in a position to be able to speak to that. And there's sometimes, I think, confusion that someone's teaching assistant, like a graduate teaching assistant, is their professor. That is not the case. And a TA's letter will not be taken nearly as seriously as a professor writing for you. So just FYI. Okay. Moving on. Okay, how do you get the strongest letter possible? So I want to emphasize, this isn't a transactional thing. This isn't you just go to someone and say, will you write for me for Truman? They say yes, and then you're like, yay, done. See you later. No contact after that point. That is not how either you establish a really great working relationship with that person or how you get a really strong letter of recommendation. In order to make sure that you are getting the strongest letter of recommendation possible and supporting that person, you want to provide additional support and guidance. So sometimes this may make you nervous. Like if I provide too much information to this person's gonna be like, you're overwhelming me with content. I mean, I wouldn't send like 10 emails. You wanna make sure that you're organized when you are communicating with this person to present the content in an easy to digest way. But you definitely wanna make sure that you're providing them with the content to help them understand what kind of the orientation or reference point is to what they should write to. So you should always provide description of the fellowship to which you're pursuing and the truman.gov address in this case, information about the submission deadline. So in this case, they would be emailing their letter as a Word document or PDF to Guffa, Gufa at georgetown.edu by October 26th. I included that in my initial kind of email with the documents. You'd want to just like highlight the selection criteria. Like Truman's looking for people who are going to be change makers, committed to public service. Like, I mean, like kind of just like these kinds of basic things. You want to include an updated version of your resume for the reference. I also say it's helpful for the person to know who else is writing for you. In Truman's case, it's helpful for, you definitely want to help the person understand what bucket they are filling. So there's obviously the academic, the leadership, and public service. You would want the leadership person to know that they are like fulfilling the leadership bucket, that you have these other 2 people who are writing for you for kind of like the academic merit piece and the public service piece, but like they would be the person fulfilling kind of like the leadership piece. So that's important for them to know. Descriptions of other kind of like relevant activities, research or projects. This would be particularly important for leadership, as we're talking about like later today, because as I said, if the person hasn't directly observed you in the leadership experience that you're going to talk about in the application, because it was like a student-led organization, it's helpful for them to have additional context about the other ways in which you've kind of like had that impact or had that kind of community engagement. So even though they haven't directly observed you in that, they can also say like, oh yes, and like, I know the ways in which she has been like translating this interest into like her work with like the Georgetown ACLU chapter or something, so that they're kind of aware of like what else is going on, so they can also reference that. Also, it's always helpful if you can provide a draft of like your application essays. And for Truman's case, for like the leadership and public service recommenders, like it'd be helpful for them to have a draft of that response. However, I would not wait until you have a draft of that response to ask someone to write for you. You can say, like, would you be like willing to write a letter of recommendation for me? If so, I'll follow up with the additional information. They say yes. You're going to be sending them all of this content. And then you can say, I'm currently working on a draft of my application. As soon as I have a working draft of my leadership response, I will send it to you for your reference. Okay. So just like notifying them like that's coming, and maybe like later on you can follow up with additional information as well. So that's helpful for them to have. Okay. The other thing, and so you may have been confused because one of the documents I sent you in that kind of getting started email was a like series of cover letters. We want the recommender, and I have it here again. They look like this. You will find the Microsoft Word document in that email that I sent. But the cover letters look like this. It is helpful if you separate out the cover letters and send the recommender like the cover letter for the one that they are writing to, because it is a logistical nightmare if we are receiving recommendations and don't know like what bucket area they are writing to. Like it just is so much work on our end. So we like really need you, and this is going to help make sure that your recommenders are writing to their like bucket area too. We want you to provide the cover letter to each of your recommenders. Like there's the public service one, there's the academic one. Provide them with the cover letter, and also including your instructions about the submission to like include the cover letter with the submission of their letter. Okay. Clear instructions for the recommender. Normally you should always address, or someone should always address the letter to like Truman Scholarship Selection Committee. So you can just do that. It's typical, what's not typical, it's really encouraged for people to use letterhead, always have some sort of electronic signature. And as I said, in this case, they'll be emailing their letter to guffa@georgetown.edu by October 26th, and we'll add it to your application. I mean, contact info for yourself. I mean, they should have your email because you'll be emailing them from your email. But you can also say if they have any questions, they're welcome to contact guffa@georgetown.edu as well. Okay. Any questions about the recommendations before I move on to the leadership piece of this? You can feel free to chat me or unmute yourself if you do have a question, because I think my next part's leadership. Okay, we're all good on this? Okay. So I wanted to spend the other part of this workshop talking about the leadership piece. Because as you know, leadership is super important to Truman because they want to identify future change makers. So they have question number 7 on the application, which is asking about a leadership experience. I don't want you just to immediately start writing that response. Like you should always have some kind of like reflection pre-writing exercise before you just start filling out an application. Because it's going to ensure that what you're writing is so much stronger and more cohesive with your application. So there's several things that you should be thinking about as you're identifying what might be my best leadership example to include. The first one is that it should be responsive to a need. We need to have an appreciation of what kind of problem existed. What was an issue that you identified? Was there a gap somewhere? What are you responding to in order to change something for the good? Okay, we need to have an understanding in the very opening context of this leadership response, what that issue is, like how you identified that issue. Okay, the other thing is that the leadership example should demonstrate some sort of initiative and innovation, right? Or mostly initiative, that you are taking the initiative after identifying a particular need or a gap, something that needs to be addressed, to do something about it. Not just that you were charged with doing a project and so like you just completed the project. That's just like doing what was required and like kind of, doing what was needed. So that's not like demonstrated as initiative. But if you were given a project, like you were interning for the Department of State, were given a project, and we're like, oh my gosh, we need to be thinking about this other piece. Like we need to be doing this thing. Then that's initiative because once again, you were recognizing a need for something and responding to it. The other thing is intentionality. In a leadership response, I always want to know how you're thinking about working through that challenge and responding to it. The intentionality piece is important because otherwise it risks becoming a narrative version of your resume. Like, I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this, and I did this. That's not very interesting. I want to know why you did something. So I recognize, like, let me think about like what would be an example here. Okay, I'll like use an example from one of our past Truman finalists who was working for a admissions company that was specifically focused on people at kind of under-resourced high schools, like helping them navigate like the college admissions process. So she was working for this admission startup and was kind of like I forget what her role was, but she realized that like the entire process could be reimagined in order to not only make their own processes more effective, but to better serve the people they were working with by orienting everything around empathy. And like what happens when you change like kind of like the model to like embrace that focus area. And so like helping me understand why she was doing that and why that would like make such a change, because she herself came from an under-resourced high school, was really important to better appreciating the nature of the impact and what she was trying to achieve. Okay, so always thinking about like how can you help the reader understand the intentionality behind what you're doing. The other piece is impact. I want to know like, okay, what happened? You don't like have a huge buildup and then like we don't like know. It's kind of like reading a novel and like not reading the last chapter. I want to know like, well, what happened? Like, how did this change how did this change the community's perspectives? Or did this get the ball rolling in some way? Did this generate a certain amount of momentum? Like, I want to know like what happened. And it doesn't need to be that like this leadership experience was like widely successful and then like everything was like, you know, amazing afterwards. It could be that it like failed. But I want to know like, okay, but in that failure, did it create other kinds of seminars or discussions about something? Like, did it generate additional conversations where like more and more people were brought to the table? That is really important for someone to know because it helps them appreciate the ways in which you were like pushing the needle forward in some way. And then the final thing is the reflection. It's always important to think about like, okay, how is what I'm presenting resonant in some way with like kind of like how I'm thinking about my future work, or like what I took from this that has impacted like who I am as a leader. Like I want to know like what personally, so like the impact piece, like what happened for the community, but the reflection piece is also like, well, how did this change you? Like it gives me a better appreciation for who you are as a person and how this relates to kind of like larger work. This can also be particularly important. The reflection piece can also be particularly important because in many cases, someone's leadership example is not necessarily related to the problem or issue of society that they want to address. And it's helpful with the reflection piece for that person who I told you who did like the kind of work about like how do we reorient our kind of advising processes to be centered on empathy, because empathy was central to how she was thinking about her future work in drug policy and addiction. Empathy being central to that. So like it was kind of a moment to like kind of like make those linkages. And by making those linkages, I think I'm a very visual person. So I like think about like you thread it back together, you're tying everything together, and someone's walking away with a really cohesive and deep understanding about like how you were thinking and how you operate, not only in your issue area, but also like as a leader. Okay. Issues to avoid. Not simply about filling a leadership position. As I said, leadership to Truman is not just like, I was the president of this organization. Like, good for you, but they don't care. I mean, like, it's good. Yeah, I should be a little bit like nicer about that. Like, if you're president of an organization, that's great. But Truman isn't just interested in the fact that you were just the president of an organization. They want to know, what are you doing that changes the status quo? So it's not just, leadership is not just about occupying a role of leadership. It's about doing something that involves being a leader. Okay, that's the difference. I know a lot of people are very humble, and things were collaborative. They were like, perhaps like something that you were involved in was done with a group, and that's completely fine. The leadership example can be about a something that you, along with like several others, like worked on together. However, we want to know what you did within that team. Okay, so there's a difference. It's not that you were claiming that you alone did everything, but rather what were you adding to that team that was helping that team think about certain things or do certain things that made that, helped that work and push it forward. Okay, so I don't want to see the entire leadership response as just about we, because you lose yourself within the we. But like, along with another classmate, I came up with this idea, or like a classmate, I came up with this idea. I realized the need to liaise with these other kinds of organizations on campus. So I took charge of like making those connections, connecting with like GSP or doing whatever. Because then I have a better appreciation of like, once again, your specific responsibilities and contributions to that project, and that is critical. The other thing is like not providing context for the reader to appreciate what you're doing. Because if this is like some like quirky like organization that you're part of, like we need to kind of like know what the organization does to understand what you're doing within it. Like we just need enough crucial context to like orient the reader and not assume that they know everything about the particularities about like Georgetown, for instance, or like Georgetown's clubs. But of course you don't want to spend like too much time on context. So there's always like the fine balance. And then as I mentioned, you don't want to just simply offer a list of accomplishments. And this is why that intentionality piece is so important to avoid just being like, I did this. Oh, and then I also did this. Oh, and by the way, I did this and I did this and I did this. And we're like, great. Okay. What do a question? Okay. Should this issue be the same issue you discussed in question number 9, which is the problem or issue? I think I just mentioned that. It doesn't need to be, and many times the leadership one does not relate to the problem or issue of society you wish to address, but you can make the connection between like lessons learned or the themes that have emerged from that leadership experience to perhaps like how you're thinking later about that issue area. I would say it's much more common for the public service response to relate to the problem or issue of society that you wish to address. I think it's really important that like one of those two relate to the problem or issue of society that you wish to address, because we do want to have some sense like you've been engaging in your community around an issue in some capacity. Now there could be exceptions to that. We can discuss later. But yes, leadership does not have to specifically be within that issue area. Some special notes. So I know for my STEM folks, so science, technology, engineering, math people, that a lot of the time might be consumed by doing research in a lab. And so you might think like, that's really hard for me to show leadership because my time has been consumed in that way. If that is you, if you are someone who has spent a lot of time in the lab, that's fine. And like Truman is looking for STEM people, definitely. But it is important for someone to understand, okay, what are you doing? How are you translating that research or that experience into other spaces? And so the example, and I think I may have mentioned this in the info session, is like someone who's kind of like working on issues in the lab is really committed to like public health in the future and develops a protocol around like hand washing or something. Like thinking about this like right now is particularly important. But that would be kind of like the community orientation, or kind of like thinking about how this is applicable outside of just within the space of the lab. And also for anybody who's in like ROTC, for leadership, we're not just talking about career progression. So it's not just like I became like the next like officer or whatever, but that we're actually talking about leadership and like what you were doing, what you were seeking to achieve, and not just like I became the next like officer title. Okay. Okay. Any questions about this before we get into like effective and ineffective responses? Because I always think it's helpful to like look at examples of this. Okay. Let us move on then. So I'm going to read this and I want you to think about, is this an effective or an ineffective response? And then we are going to, you can like privately chat me thoughts or like chat to everyone, but we're going to reflect upon this. Okay, so as an orientation leader, I was awarded the opportunity to play an active role in the initial experiences of new students at my school. While the position required activities such as monitoring placement tests and assisting with class registration, I reveled in the opportunity to answer students' and parents' questions about the college experience. While I was required to sit on parent panels and present flip chart presentations, I enjoyed the one-on-one experiences. During one of the orientation sessions, a new student and I started talking about how he was afraid that he was going to be surrounded by a bunch of pot-smoking, binge drinking, and not studying classmates. I enjoyed being able to serve as an individual that could show him that college was not about those things, but was about studying, meeting new people, learning new things, and enjoying new experiences. I emphasized that there was partying in college, but you did not have to participate or be looked down upon if you did not party. I recommended that he join a couple of clubs in the fall and meet people with similar interests. When I walked by him on campus in the fall, I said hi and proceeded on my way. That Tuesday at my student government meeting, he was sworn in as a representative at large. I do not know if it took talking to me to begin to change his perception or if some other individual may have provided that same information. However, I enjoy knowing my one-on-one interaction might have made a difference, perhaps even more than my flip chart and skip presentations to 1,200 freshmen regarding the same issues. Thoughts? Did you think this was, oh, let's just like say, like, what did you think worked well, didn't work well?
It seems a little surface level, and that whoever this was talking more about, I guess, the person they thought they helped, but wasn't certain that they were the one that helped them. So it's not very like specific, but they do explain like what they did. But I don't know if like that is like a narrative style of like resume making, but I guess that's what I'm thinking right now.
Okay. So kind of like vague. We don't like really have a sense of like impact. The person's like, maybe I impacted this person, maybe I didn't. Okay. Any other thoughts?
It's just kind of generally blah. Blase. Yeah, I don't know.
If you were here, you would just write blah on like the notes. Okay. What to you made it blah? Just like there was nothing that stood out to you?
Yeah, there was not a clear story told. I think like from the beginning, like having this position, doing this kind of work, and then not being able to tie in the actual impact like with the story about the specific student that they chose, like the acknowledgement of the fact that it might have been somebody else who impacted this person, like it was just very much not tied together.
Okay. Any other comments, thoughts?
And they're not really talking about anything particularly innovative. Like I think this falls into the category that you were talking about where they were just like fulfilling their role in this position. They didn't like create a new program as part of orientation or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any final comments? Okay. Yeah, I mean, everything you guys shared is right. I mean, like not is right. There's not like right or wrong answer here. It's kind of like, but I think it's important to put you in the role of a reviewer to understand like how someone who's reading your own materials might be thinking. And so Truman did find this an ineffective response for the very reasons that you guys just emphasized. We don't have a sense of like the impact. I mean, this person has like a one-on-one conversation. It seems very kind of granular and like, there's not a sense of like larger kind of how this person was pushing someone forward, how they were addressing a need, how they were like, you know, having this larger scale impact. There's a lot of just kind of like kind of build up to this. As I think someone said it was like, you didn't like really feel like there was like any takeaway here. Yeah, I mean, like, this is the kind of response that you probably would like in dozens of responses would like forget about really fast. What's fascinating though, is in this person references down here, skip presentations to 1,200 freshmen regarding the same issues. I would have been like, did you like do something, come up with new skip presentations that changed how people were thinking about these things? Like there seems like there's like other kind of content here that might be like way more interesting and relevant to include for the leadership response. But and I actually think this one's good to talk about too, because I think many people have experiences serving as a mentor in some capacity, and like that might be an experience that they want to talk about, and that can be fine. But Truman is not going to be as compelled by a story about like a one-on-one interaction. Like someone walked away with like increased knowledge about something. They would want to know how are you reforming perhaps like the process or like the mentorship program that's making sure the program better serves individuals. So the one-on-one thing is not going to be as compelling to them as like, I was a mentor within this organization and I wanted to rethink how we like did this program, or like kind of rethink our training of mentors so that we could better serve people. Like that would be more interesting to Truman, because once again, they're like interested in that kind of like larger scale kind of like change. Not to say that like the organization has to be like the super, like, I mean, super big organization or like have tons of people in it, but we do want to know how you're kind of operating in that, at that kind of like level. Okay. Here's another one. So during an international service trip in Bolivia, I visited a classroom in which the students did not have a wide range of books to enhance their studies. I realized that the problems facing society could not wait until I had established myself in a career, and I must act immediately. This international experience and my passion for education led me to create the Books for Bolivian Children Foundation. Books for Bolivian Children is committed to promoting global education through the collection and redistribution of books. At the beginning of this journey, I was directing Books for Bolivian Children with the help of a few friends, community volunteers, and faculty members. We collected a surprising 2,000 books by the end of the semester, and I began expanding the foundation to other universities in the area. In order to fulfill one of my larger goals, I created the Books for Bolivian Children Board of Students. This board sought to expand the book collection efforts and build community relationships with larger universities in the community. As the president of the board, my peers and I increased our volunteer numbers, collection sites, and statewide project awareness. Today, I continue to direct the vision of Books for Bolivian Children and lead its inspiring volunteers. To date, we have collected well over 15,000 books from 11 universities and use them to facilitate educational collaboration in communities all over Bolivia. Okay, thoughts on this one? Can either be things you liked, things you didn't like, things you were confused by?
I thought it did a good job of kind of talking about her impact and her role, but I just wish it talked more about like what it meant for her to like have this type of like program, and like why it was so important for her to start this. But other than that, I thought it was like pretty good.
Okay, so you got like a good sense of like impact, like person's reach. Okay. Other thoughts? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I also think it connected the sort of like identification of an issue and then like call to action. Like there was a, you know, clear part about, you know, her experiencing people and then the creation of the foundation as a result of this need for books.
Okay, so we have like the responding to a need piece. We have like the impact piece and responding to a need piece. Okay, any other thoughts? Yeah, I mean, I will say like Truman found this more effective, definitely more effective than the last response. I will say that though, even though this one is a more effective one, doesn't necessarily mean it's a perfect one. I mean, like you can always be, can always do edits, but was it like Natalia? I think like, were you mentioning that like you wish you had known a little bit more about this kinds of like what drew them to engage with this? And so like, this is one of those things where I would be like, I would have loved to know a little bit more like intentionality or like, kind of like what was informing like their choices of what they were doing. I think to make it a little bit more personal, and perhaps like there's also like no reflection here either. And I think sometimes that reflection piece is what can help make something seem a little bit more personal and not just like starting to be a little bit more of like a narrative version of the resume of like, this is just kind of like what I did. But like we understand a little bit more of like the context about like within this context what they recognize the need for, and then like what they were seeking to do in the impact piece. So that was good. Yes. Any other final thoughts about this one? I will say, so these are all, I took these from like the Truman website. And I linked to it in my last presentation. I think I also have it down here. Is this down here? Oh yeah. You can like test yourself because Truman has these kinds of satisfactory and unsatisfactory responses for most of the questions. And it's just really helpful to see. And they also have like a little bit of a description of like why they found it effective or ineffective. So that's, I think, helpful to just check out and get a sense of kind of like what these other responses looked like. So definitely check that out later. Some other notes, and I actually already mentioned this, but the leadership recommender doesn't necessarily need to have observed you in this experience. So that's completely fine. It's just important to have, give them additional context of the other kinds of activities that you've engaged in to help kind of like orient them. And then also, I also responded to this one too. Doesn't need to be in the issue area, though. If it wasn't related in the leadership one, I would hope to see it in the public service one. There could be exceptions to this, but just to once again demonstrate the fact that you have a track record of engagement around the issue, it's helpful if one of those two does pertain to the issue area. Okay. Oh, I guess that's it. So any questions about leadership? Okay.